There is a place on this planet where 1,000 stone giants have been silent for 700 years, where an entire civilization vanished so fast that scientists still cannot agree on why, where the last tree was cut down by someone who already knew it was the last one, and where local folklore turned out to be more accurate than science by 300 years. This is not fiction. This is not a conspiracy theory. These are documented facts, and some of them were literally buried underground until very recently. You think you know the story of Easter Island? Stone heads, mysterious statues, a vanished people. A pretty picture from a textbook. Here is the thing, the textbook is wrong. Or, to be more precise, it is giving you maybe a third of the actual story. Because the real story is far darker, far more complicated, and far closer to what is happening right now. To us, to our world, to our resources. Who actually destroyed this civilization? The Rapa Nui themselves, or those who came after them? Why do the statues look not at the ocean, but at the people? And what did that really mean? How did a people capable of crossing the Pacific Ocean without a compass or maps end up trapped on their own island? And why did one of the most famous scientists in the world possibly draw the wrong conclusion from this story, while the entire world believed him? The answers to all of these questions are in this video. No cuts, no simplifications, with dates, names, facts, and details that popular retellings usually leave out. Watch until the end, because the most unexpected part is not at the beginning. April 1722. Dutch Admiral Jacob Roggeveen is navigating 3 ships across the Pacific in search of the legendary southern continent. Navigation runs on starlight and instinct, water supplies are running low, and the crew has been exhausted by months at sea. Then, land. A tiny island in the middle of absolute oceanic emptiness. Roggeveen orders the anchor dropped. The day happens to be Easter Sunday. That is how the island gets its European name, Easter Island. This refers to one of the most disorienting first contacts in the entire history of European exploration. What the admiral saw from the deck of his ship defied all logic. Along the coastlines stood hundreds of enormous stone figures. Not ruins, not rubble. Complete, vertical, gazing inland with absolute stone composure. Roggeveen was a seasoned sailor who had seen plenty of exotic shores, but here he was at a loss. In his ship's log, he wrote without embellishment. These idols astonish the imagination by their size, but what is even more astounding is how people who have no strong timber for making machines were able to erect them. This is not a tourist's excitement. This is an engineer's confusion staring at a structure he cannot explain. Roggeveen went ashore. The islanders greeted him without fear. They apparently had no concept of who Europeans were, or where their enormous sail-driven ships came from. The first contact was peaceful, though it was marred by a shooting. One of the sailors decided the locals were behaving suspiciously, opened fire, and several islanders lost their lives. Roggeveen described it in his journal as an unfortunate misunderstanding. Typical colonial diplomacy. But something else matters more. The admiral, surveying the island, recorded details with the meticulousness of a man who understands he must write this down because no one will believe him on his word alone. He described the inhabitants as lean, covered in tattoos, some with earlobes stretched all the way to their shoulders. He described cultivated fields, primitive huts, chickens and cooking fires. Ordinary life, next to something entirely inexplicable. This refers to the island's central paradox, people living in conditions of extreme poverty, surrounded by monuments that still baffle engineers today. The statues Roggeveen saw are not simply stones. Some of them reach the height of a 4-story building. The heaviest of the completed ones weighs around 82 tons, more than a modern battle tank. And every one of them was carved by hand, without metal tools, using only stone chisels. On an island with no iron, no bronze, and no wheel in any practical sense, people created structures that today would require a heavy construction crane. Roggeveen saw this and could not explain it. 300 years later, scientists are still arguing about the details. Nearly 1,000 stone figures. Not 100, not 200. Nearly 1,000, scattered across an island the size of a small county. Some stand on ceremonial platforms along the coast. Others lie unfinished on the slopes of a volcano, as if the craftsmen dropped their tools and walked away in a single day, without explanation. A third of them never reached their destination. They are frozen mid-route on ancient roads, upright as if caught mid-step. These are not decorations. This is engineering without machinery, monumental construction without the wheel, without iron, without cranes. People of the Stone Age built objects that a professional construction crew with modern equipment would still find challenging to move. The scale of the Moai resists easy comprehension until you start comparing them to something familiar. The average statue stands around 4 meters tall, but that is the average. Some reach the height of a 4-story residential building. The heaviest of the completed and erected ones weighs around 82 tons. For comparison, a modern main battle tank weighs around 65 tons. The Moai is heavier than a tank, and this is stone that people dragged up to 20 kilometers across rough terrain without a single mechanical device. This refers to one of the most extraordinary examples of collective physical labor in the history of pre-industrial civilizations. The material is volcanic tough, soft by stone standards, but stone nonetheless. It was carved exclusively with stone axes and chisels. No metal, no abrasive tools in any modern sense. The quarries were located inside the crater of the Rano Raraku volcano. It is there, on its slopes, that unfinished statues can still be seen today, literally embedded in the rock face. The largest of the unfinished ones, known as El Gigante, reaches 21 meters in length and weighs an estimated 270 tons. It was never fully extracted. Perhaps the builders simply realized it could never be moved. The appearance of every Moai follows a single, rigid canon, and there is something almost military in the discipline of its execution. An elongated face, heavy brow ridges overhanging deep-set eye sockets, a long, straight nose with sharply defined nostrils, thin, tightly pressed lips, a jutting chin, pronounced cheekbones, ears disproportionately long with extended lobes. Not one statue smiles. Not one expresses fear. They simply stare. These are the faces of people who made a decision and have no intention of explaining it. This refers to a deliberate artistic strategy. The Moai were not built to be admired. They were built to project authority. Modern anthropologists lean toward the view that the statues depict real people, chiefs, shamans, clan founders, ancestors whose power, according to Rapa Nui belief, continued to operate after their passing. The statue was not a memorial, it was a channel. Through it, a clan addressed its ancestor, seeking protection, harvest, victory over a rival. The Moai stood with their backs to the ocean and their faces toward the village. They looked at the living, not at the water. This is a critical detail that is frequently overlooked. But here is the problem. Everything stated above is conjecture. Well-reasoned, supported by comparative anthropology and Polynesian parallels, but conjecture nonetheless. The island's writing system, Rongorongo, remains only partially deciphered. The speakers who could have explained its meaning disappeared in the 19th century. Of approximately 2,000 wooden tablets bearing inscriptions, 26 survived. 26 out of 2,000, and even their meaning remains a subject of dispute among linguists. The stone faces stare. They say nothing, and they have no intention of answering. Around the year 1000 AD, somewhere in the central Pacific Ocean, Several large, double-hulled canoes are moving eastward. On board, a few dozen people: men, women, children. Seeds, livestock, food and water supplies. No maps, they did not exist. No compass, the Polynesians had none. Navigation was done by stars, by the direction of the waves, by the behavior of birds, by the color of the water on the horizon. These people read the ocean the way a literate person reads a text, fluently, effortlessly, from memory. They set out from the Marquesas Islands and covered several thousand kilometers of open water, seeing no land for weeks at a time. This was not an adventure. It was a deliberate expansion. The Polynesians were systematically searching for new islands, knowing from generations of experience that land was out there. They were not sailing blindly, they were sailing by a system. When the canoes finally reached the shores of Rapa Nui, the first settlers found themselves in a place that by Polynesian standards was close to paradise. The island was covered in dense forests of Chilean palms, reaching 25 meters in height. Coastal waters were full of fish. The soil was volcanic, young, rich, responsive. The climate was mild. No large predators, no competitors for resources. Complete isolation, which in this case was an advantage rather than a curse. This refers to the moment when the history of Rapa Nui could still have unfolded in an entirely different direction. The first settlers began to establish themselves. They brought what they knew: sweet potatoes, taro, bananas, sugarcane. They raised chickens and pigs. They built houses, first simple ones from wood and leaves, then increasingly substantial structures. The population grew. Within a few generations, the island was home not to dozens, but to thousands of people. At the peak of the island's prosperity, estimated around the 12th to 13th century, the population reached between 10 and 15,000, depending on which study you consult. For an island covering 164 square kilometers, that is a high density, very high. Society became structured. Clans emerged with defined territories, hierarchies, and their own traditions. Chiefs and priests appeared. Craftsmen who specialized in specific tasks and passed their skills down through generations appeared. A writing system appeared, Rongo Rongo, unique across all of Polynesia. This was not a primitive tribal community, but a genuinely complex social system with a division of labor, religious institutions, and political competition between factions. This refers to what tends to be underestimated. The Rapa Nui were not primitives with stone axes, but an organized civilization with its own internal logic of development. It was precisely during this period of prosperity, well-fed, densely populated, socially complex, that the construction of the Moai began. The first statues were relatively modest. But the logic of inter-clan competition operates the same way in every era and every culture. If your neighbor raised a statue 3 meters tall, yours needs to be 4. If his clan spent a year on a monument, yours spends 2. Ambitions scaled alongside capabilities and, as would later become clear, far faster than resources could recover. The island at this moment looked like a success story. People who had arrived from nowhere had built a functioning society on bare volcanic rock. They fed themselves, organized collective labor, created monuments that still stand 1,000 years later. By any measure, an achievement. But it was precisely here, at the peak of prosperity, that the mechanism was set in motion that would destroy all of it. The Moai were never simply art. Anyone who looks at them as a religious sculpture project or an aesthetic endeavor is missing the point entirely. Every statue was a political statement, a public demonstration of power, a tool for applying pressure on neighbors. Rapa Nui society was divided into clans that controlled different parts of the island, and between them ran a constant, unrelenting struggle for prestige, resources, and influence. The Moai were the currency of that struggle. except that instead of money, what counted were tons of stone and meters of height. The logic was perfectly simple and perfectly dangerous. A clan that erected the largest statue was signaling to everyone else, "We have enough people, enough food, enough organization to spend a year on a piece of rock." It was a display of strength, the same kind as a military parade or a skyscraper in the modern world. And the neighboring clan, naturally, could not ignore that. It began building its own statue, larger, more costly, taller, heavier. This refers to the mechanism that historians and anthropologists call escalation dynamics, the same dynamic that drove the powers of the 20th century to build ever more missiles, tanks, and aircraft carriers. The scale of Moai production was industrial, in the complete absence of any industry. In the quarries of the Rano Raraku volcano, hundreds of people worked simultaneously. Some carved the outline of the statue directly into the rock face. Others gradually undercut the base, still others smoothed the surface. The work was done with stone tools, basalt picks and obsidian chisels. No metal, no mechanical devices. Only human hands, muscle and patience multiplied across hundreds of people. Archaeologist Joanne van Tilburg, who devoted several decades to studying the Moai, carried out a detailed calculation of the labor involved. By her estimates, carving a single statue of average size took around 1 year of work by a crew of 15 people. That is carving alone, without transportation, without installation, without constructing the Ahu platform on which the statue would ultimately stand. Counting the full cycle from start to finish, the figures multiply many times over. This refers to the fact that Moai construction was not a hobby or a seasonal activity. It was constant, heavy, organized work that consumed a significant portion of the island's labor resources. Working in parallel with the carvers were the rope makers. The ropes were braided from the bark fibers of the hau tree, strong but requiring substantial quantities of raw material. Other crews built wooden sledges and platforms for moving the statues. Still others laid out and maintained the road network, an extensive system of paths connecting the quarries to the coast. Along these roads, the statues needed to travel to their platforms. Distances reached 20 kilometers. This with weights of dozens of tons and no wheeled transport of any kind. Exactly how the Rapa Nui moved the finished statues was the central headache for researchers for decades. Numerous theories were proposed: wooden sledges with log rollers, rope systems with counterweights, earthen ramps. Each theory explained some facts and contradicted others. Some researchers calculated that transporting the largest statues by roller method would have required quantities of timber that simply did not exist on the island, even at the period of maximum forest cover. Local folklore offered its own answer, simple and at first glance absurd. The statues walked on their own. The ancestors moved them through the power of spirit. Scientists, naturally, dismissed this as mythology, with no bearing on actual technology. As would later turn out, that was a mistake. The folklore was right. The scientists were not. In 2012, a team of researchers led by anthropologist Carl Lipo and archaeologist Terry Hunt decided to test what the local people of Rapa Nui had been repeating for centuries. The statues walked on their own. Not on sledges, not on log rollers, not along earthen ramps. They moved upright, swaying, rocking, like a person carrying a heavy load. That is what the legend said. That is how elders explained to children why unfinished Moai stood along the ancient roads. They simply never arrived. They stopped along the way. Most researchers up to that point had treated such explanations with condescension. Beautiful mythology, a poetic image, nothing more. A stone statue weighing dozens of tons cannot walk. It contradicts physics, common sense, and everything taught in engineering departments. That was the consensus among specialists. Until the experiment. Lipo and Hunt built an exact replica of a Moai, made of concrete, weighing around 5 tons, with the proportions of the original preserved. They then attached 3 ropes to it, 2 on the sides, 1 at the back. A crew of 18 people took their positions. The side ropes were pulled alternately, rocking the statue from side to side. The rear rope prevented it from toppling forward, and the statue walked. This refers to one of those moments in science when a simple experiment overturns decades of theoretical construction. The movement looked exactly as the folklore described, swaying, rolling from one edge of the base to the other, slowly advancing forward. Not fast, not elegant, but effective. According to the team's calculations, using this method, a group of 26 people could move an average-sized statue at a rate of around 100 meters per hour. A 15-kilometer road would take several days of continuous work. That is realistic. It explains the wear patterns on the bases of many Moai, characteristic chips and abrasions in precisely the locations where contact with the road surface would occur under this method of movement. But the most important discovery was not the method itself. The most important thing was what it explained, a detail that no one had previously been able to account for convincingly. Along the ancient roads of the island, at various distances from the quarries, stand and lie dozens of unfinished and undelivered statues. Some are toppled, some stand upright in the middle of the road, as if simply abandoned mid-journey. Previous theories, involving sledges and rollers, gave no convincing explanation for why so many statues ended up in a vertical position along the routes. If they were carried on sledges, they should have been lying flat. If they walked upright, everything falls into place. A statue that people stopped pulling was simply left standing, or it fell when they tried to halt its momentum. Hence the picture. Vertical figures along the roads, frozen forever at the point where the strength, the ropes, or the will to continue ran out. This refers to how one experiment, lasting a few hours, provided the answer to a question that had tormented researchers for more than 2 centuries. The walking statue theory is not definitive. In science, there are no definitive theories. Some researchers still maintain that additional methods were used when transporting the heaviest monuments. Statues weighing more than 50 tons, when rocked upright, generate enormous stress on the base, and the risk of structural failure would have been very high. It is possible that lighter and medium-sized Moai genuinely walked, while the largest ones were still transported on other structures. But the principle itself, vertical movement using ropes, is now accepted by most specialists as at least a partial solution to the mystery. And there is a detail here that is rarely stated out loud. The Rapa Nui preserved the correct answer for centuries. They passed it from generation to generation through oral traditions that educated European researchers dismissed as superstition. The answer was in plain sight. People simply did not want to listen to it. Ropes. This detail is rarely discussed, but it was ropes that formed the first link in the chain that strangled the civilization of Rapa Nui. Every transportation of a statue required hundreds of meters of strong cable. The ropes were braided from the bark fibers of the hau tree. The hau tree grew abundantly on the island while it lasted. But every statue dragged toward the coast left behind a pile of frayed, torn, unusable rope. And every time, new rope was needed, which meant new trees. Again and again. That was not the only drain on the island's timber. Building the ceremonial ahu platforms on which the Moai stood required logs. The daily life of a growing population required firewood for cooking fires, timber for housing, material for building canoes. Canoes deserve special mention. Without them, deep-sea fishing was impossible, and fish were the island's primary source of protein. Every large canoe required several substantial trunks. Every storm that wrecked a boat meant more trees under the axe. This refers to what economists call the tragedy of the commons, when every individual participant acts rationally in their own interest, and the combined result of those rational actions turns into a catastrophe for everyone. Paleobotanist John Flenley spent years reconstructing the precise picture of what happened. The method he used seems counterintuitive at first glance. Analysis of pollen in the sediment layers at the bottom of the island's lakes. The logic is straightforward. On the lakebed, layer upon layer of pollen particles settle from plants that existed during each specific period. It is a natural archive, precise, impartial, immune to human interpretation. Flenley was literally reading the island's history through layers of lake silt. What he read left no room for optimistic interpretation. Before the arrival of people, roughly before the year 1000 AD, the island was covered in dense forest. The dominant species was the Chilean palm, reaching 25 meters in height and capable of living for hundreds of years. Alongside it grew hau trees, toromiro, and other species, forming a complex forest ecosystem. The island was not tropical jungle, the climate does not allow for that, but it was a genuine forest, dense, diverse, stable. Then the pollen layers begin to change. Slowly at first, in the early centuries after settlement, the forest retreated gradually. Then faster. Then in a collapse. By the year 1400, tree pollen in the sediment layers has virtually disappeared. That means one thing: the forest is gone. Not thinned, not reduced. Gone, entirely. In 400 years, people destroyed what nature had built over millennia. This refers to one of the fastest documented cases of complete forest clearance in the history of human civilizations. But there was one more detail that Flenley recorded in his notes, one that makes a particular impression. The last tree on Easter Island was felled around the year 1650. Not during the active period of statue construction, not in the era of peak prosperity, after the civilization had already begun to unravel, after it had already become evident that almost no forest remained. Someone still picked up an axe and cut down the last tree. The last one on an island of 164 square kilometers, surrounded by ocean on all sides, with no possibility of rapid recovery. This is not a metaphor or a literary device, it is a documented fact, and it raises a question to which science has no definitive answer. Did that person know they were cutting down the last tree? Did they understand what they were doing? Or did they simply need wood, for a fire, for a canoe, for construction, and took what remained? Most likely the latter. That is precisely the mechanism of ecological collapse. No one decides to destroy everything. Each person makes only a small, immediately necessary decision, and the sum of those decisions destroys everything. The disappearance of the forest was not visible in real time. Trees were not felled all at once. 1 by 1, 10 by 10, 100 at a time. Each generation saw slightly less forest than the previous one and considered it normal. Psychologists call this shifting baseline syndrome. Whatever exists now feels normal, even if it is catastrophically less than what existed before. The Rapa Nui did not see a catastrophe. They saw their ordinary lives, simply growing a little harder with each passing year. When a forest disappears, it is not just timber that disappears. Everything that depended on it disappears along with it. The Rapa Nui discovered this not in theory, but in practice, generation after generation, with accelerating speed and accelerating horror. The first blow was erosion. Tree roots had held the volcanic soil on the slopes in place. A thin, laboriously accumulated layer suitable for cultivation. Without trees, rainfall began washing that layer directly into the ocean. Fields that had fed 10,000 people produced smaller and smaller harvests. The sweet potatoes shrank. The taro rotted in the waterlogged, exhausted soil. The bananas failed to ripen. Hunger did not arrive all at once. It crept in gradually, making life a little more meager, a little harsher, a little more hopeless with each passing year. The second blow came from the sea. Without large trees, building seaworthy canoes became impossible. Small boats for coastal fishing could still be cobbled together from scraps, but venturing into the open ocean, where tuna and dolphins ran, was no longer possible. The fish resources of the island's coastal waters are incomparably poorer than those of the open sea. Protein became catastrophically scarce. People turned to birds and hunted them out, to sea turtles and caught them out, to the rats that had arrived with the first settlers aboard the canoes and had multiplied across the entire island. When the primary protein source in a civilization's diet becomes rat, that is not decline, that is the bottom. This refers to the fact that the collapse of an ecosystem and the collapse of a society are not two separate processes. They are the same process, simply observed from different angles. It was precisely then that something appeared in the island's cultural layers that had not been there before. Archaeologists excavating on Rapa Nui document a sharp increase in the number of matar, obsidian spearheads and dart points, beginning around the 15th century. Obsidian exists on the island. Its source is the Rano Kau volcano, but up to a certain point it had been used primarily for cutting tools, scrapers, knives, chisels for working stone. Matar is a weapon, specialized, deliberately designed to inflict wounds on people. Their appearance in large quantities is not hunting equipment and not coincidence. It is evidence that organized armed conflict over resources had begun on the island. Clans that had previously competed over the size of their statues now competed over the number of dead neighbors. The logic was identical. The stronger survive. Only the rules of the game had changed. Instead of quarries, raids. Instead of ropes, spears. Instead of architects and stone carvers, warriors. This refers to how quickly social institutions, built up over centuries, can collapse under the pressure of resource scarcity. It took Rapa Nui less than 100 years to travel from monumental construction to inter-clan warfare. The apex of this destruction was the deliberate toppling of the Moai themselves. Statues that had required years of collective labor, that had embodied clan pride and religious authority, began to be pulled down. Not accidentally, not as a result of earthquakes or landslides. Deliberately, using levers, organized effort, groups of people working in concert. The statue was brought face down. The red stone top-knots, called pukao, placed on the heads of the Moai as symbols of status and power, were smashed. This was not vandalism in the modern sense. It was a ritual destruction of a rival's authority. Toppling a neighboring clan's Moai meant severing its connection to its ancestors, stripping it of spiritual protection, publicly humiliating and weakening it. By the time Europeans arrived at the island, most of the coastal Ahu platforms were fields of toppled statues. What Roggeveen had seen standing in 1722, subsequent expeditions no longer found. By the end of the 18th century, virtually everything had been brought down. The last standing group of statues was toppled, according to available records, around 1842. Nearly 1,000 monuments built over the course of several centuries lay in ruins. Patrick Kirch, one of the leading specialists in Polynesian archaeology, delivers his diagnosis bluntly and without sentiment. The collapse of Rapa Nui is not a mystery and not mysticism. It is the predictable outcome of two factors operating simultaneously and reinforcing each other. First, overpopulation of an island with limited resources. Second, religious and political rivalry between clans that made any collective decision to limit consumption impossible. No one could say, "Stop cutting the trees," because whoever said that to their own clan put it at a disadvantage relative to neighbors who kept cutting. The classic collective action trap. the same one that humanity has not learned to escape from today. When Roggeveen stepped ashore in 1722, he did not see a great civilization. He saw its wreckage. People lived in primitive huts of stone and straw. There was almost no clothing. Food was scarce. The admiral himself described the inhabitants as poor and miserable. And that was not European arrogance, it was precise documentation of fact. The island that several centuries earlier had fed 15,000 people held barely 2,000 to 3,000 at the time of first European contact. Half the statues were already toppled. The secrets of their construction had been lost. The people who remembered how the Ahu platforms were built and how the Moai were moved had either perished in the wars or taken their knowledge with them. This was a civilization that had survived its own collapse and existed in a state of chronic trauma. Not dead, but no longer alive in any former sense. The Europeans, however, did not come to help. They came to take. The first decades brought sporadic contact. A few expeditions, a few confrontations, a few diseases left on the shore alongside trinkets for trade. Smallpox, measles, venereal diseases. The Rapa Nui had no immunity against any of them. Every ship that put into shore left behind a wave of illness when it departed. The population continued to contract, no longer from hunger and warfare, but from microbes that cannot be seen and against which there is no defense. This refers to the standard mechanism of demographic catastrophe at first contact between isolated populations and carriers of foreign pathogens. Rapa Nui was not an exception, it was the rule. But the real blow came in 1862. In December, Peruvian ships arrived at the island. Not merchant vessels, not research ships, slave ships. Peru at that period was experiencing a severe labor shortage on its guano extraction operations, the harvesting of bird droppings used as fertilizer. The work was exhausting, lethal, and required large numbers of people who did not need to be paid. Rapa Nui was far enough away that the international community was unlikely to concern itself too much with whatever happened there. The method was simple and cynical. The Peruvians lured islanders aboard their ships under various pretexts, allegedly for trade, allegedly for negotiations. Then the ships moved away from shore. That was it. No one came back. Over the course of several months, from December 1862 through early 1863, more than 1,500 people were taken from the island. With a population of 2,000 to 3,000, that meant between half and two-thirds of all inhabitants were taken into slavery. But the worst thing was not the abduction itself. The worst thing was who was taken. Among them was virtually the entire intellectual and cultural elite of the island. Chiefs, priests, keepers of the Rongo writing, people who could read and write in the only original written language in all of Polynesia. Everything stored in their memory. Rituals, histories, the meaning of symbols, technologies vanished along with them. On the Peruvian guano islands of Chincha, most of them perished within months from disease and brutal labor. This refers to one of the clearest examples of the targeted destruction of a people's cultural memory. Not through the burning of books, but through the physical elimination of those who could read those books. International pressure eventually forced Peru to release the survivors. But of 1,500 people, only around 100 were able to return to the island. And they brought smallpox with them. The epidemic cut down a significant portion of those who had remained. By 1866, no more than 600 people lived on Rapa Nui. It was precisely at this moment that Catholic missionaries arrived on the island. Formally, on a humanitarian mission, to help the survivors, to bring civilization and faith. In practice, they completed what the slave traders had begun. The missionaries declared the Rongo script diabolical. Tablets bearing texts were burned. The few residents who could still read anything at all were converted to Christianity, and persuaded to renounce their former culture as sin. Of the approximately 2,000 wooden tablets covered in rongo-rongo signs, 26 survive to this day. 26. Not one of them has been fully deciphered. Not a single living person can read them the way those taken to Peru once could. In 1888, Chile annexed the island, without negotiation. Without a treaty that the island's inhabitants fully understood. The Rapa Nui were effectively turned into bonded laborers on the sheep ranches that came to cover the entire island. They were prohibited from leaving the territory allocated to them, a small settlement called Hanga Roa. The rest of the island belonged to a livestock company. The Rapa Nui received Chilean citizenship only in 1966. Until that, they were people without citizenship, without rights, and without any ability to make their own decisions about their land. By that time, the indigenous population had fallen to fewer than 1,000 people. 1,000 people. On an island that had once housed 15,000, where nearly 1,000 monumental statues had stood, where a unique writing system, unique architecture, a unique navigation system, and a unique culture had existed. All of it had passed through ecological collapse, inter-clan warfare, slave trading, epidemics, missionary destruction, and colonial subjugation. And survived, barely, but survived. In 1955, Norwegian traveller and researcher Thor Heyerdahl organised the first full-scale scientific expedition to Easter Island. Before him, the island had attracted the curious, adventurers, and passing sailors. Heyerdahl brought archaeologists, anthropologists, and a systematic approach. His expedition conducted the first large-scale excavations, documented hundreds of sites, and collected samples for dating. From a scientific standpoint, a breakthrough. From a theoretical standpoint, a disaster. Heyerdahl was convinced, publicly and in his writings, that the island had been settled from South America. Not from Polynesia, from Peru. His primary argument was the sweet potato, a crop native to the Andes that the Rapa Nui had been cultivating long before any European contact. How did the sweet potato get to the island if there was no contact with America? Heyerdahl answered that question as follows. People sailed from America and brought it with them. In 1947, he personally crossed the Pacific on the balsa raft Kon-Tiki, proving that such a journey was technically possible. The world applauded. The book sold millions of copies. The theory seemed convincing. It was wrong. This refers to one of the most instructive episodes in the history of science, when a brilliantly executed experiment proves that something is possible, but does not prove that it actually happened. Genetics settled the matter, bluntly and without ceremony. DNA analysis of modern Rapa Nui people and ancient remains found on the island produced an unambiguous result. The origin is Polynesian. The Marquesas Islands, as linguistic and cultural anthropology had already suggested. No Peruvian trace in the core genome. The Rapa Nui language, Polynesian. Architectural traditions, Polynesian. Religious practices, Polynesian. Heyerdahl, for all his courage and enthusiasm, built a theory on a single artifact and ignored everything else. In science, this is called confirmation bias, when you search for evidence of your idea and fail to notice the contradictions. But here is the interesting part. The sweet potato still requires an explanation. And genetics provided one. Just not at all the one Heyerdahl expected. Research published in 2019 in the journal Nature revealed something that overturned the conventional picture of Pacific history. The genomes of modern Rapa Nui people do contain a small but statistically significant admixture of indigenous American genes, most likely from peoples living on the Pacific coast of Colombia. And this admixture dates to approximately 1200 to 1250 AD. That is long before Columbus, long before any documented European voyage to the Americas, and long before the Spanish colonizers who reached the Pacific coast of South America. This means one thing: Polynesians reached the shores of America. It was not Europeans who brought Polynesians to the New World. Polynesians found the New World themselves and came back, bringing people or their genes with them, and the sweet potato along for the ride. This is not a hypothesis or a conjecture. It is a documented genetic fact, replicated across multiple independent studies by different research teams from different countries. This refers to a discovery that completely reframes the understood scale of Polynesian navigation. People without a compass, without metal tools, without maps, crossed the largest ocean on the planet in both directions. They found islands where, by all calculations, nothing should have been. They reached an entire continent and returned home. That is not luck. That is a system. That is a level of seamanship that Western civilization only matched during the Age of Discovery, and then only with the help of compasses, sextants, and detailed charts. Heyerdahl was wrong about his theory, but right about one thing. There was contact between Rapa Nui and South America. He simply got the direction wrong. It was not Americans who came to the island, it was the islanders who went to America. And that, when you think about it, is a considerably more impressive story. Modern research on the island does not stop at genetics. In the 2010s, archaeologists confirmed what had long been suspected, but could not be proven. The famous stone heads actually have bodies, full bodies extending several meters underground. Millennia of erosion, deposits and vegetation had concealed the lower portions of the statues. When systematic excavations began around several Moai in the Rano Raraku quarry, it emerged that some of them reached 10 meters in total height, and on the bodies hidden underground, petroglyphs, carved images, signs, symbols whose meaning has not yet been established. Statues that appeared well studied after 300 years of observation turned out to have been only half understood, in the most literal sense. Jared Diamond, professor, author of Collapse, one of the most widely read science writers of recent decades, drew a simple and brutal conclusion from the history of Rapa Nui. Easter Island, in his account, is a model, a scaled-down version of what is happening and will happen to the entire planet if humanity does not change its relationship to natural resources. An isolated ecosystem, a growing population, competing groups incapable of agreeing on shared limits, resources depleted faster than they recover, collapse. Diamond laid it all out and said, "Look carefully, because the entire globe is next." The book sold millions of copies. The argument seemed ironclad. The history of Easter Island became the textbook example of ecological catastrophe caused by human irresponsibility. Taught in universities, cited at climate conferences, included in curricula. Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo disagree, categorically. The same researchers who proved that the statues walked on ropes spent years studying the actual chronology of the Rapa Nui collapse, and they reached a conclusion that is inconvenient for Diamond's elegant narrative framework. The Rapa Nui, according to their data, did not destroy themselves on their own, or more precisely, not only on their own. External factors played no smaller and possibly a greater role in the island's demographic catastrophe than internal ones. This refers to a fundamental scientific dispute whose outcome determines not merely academic reputations, but what lesson humanity will draw from this history. Hunt and Lipo point to the following. First, the island's population before European contact was, in all likelihood, considerably smaller than conventionally assumed. The figure of 15,000 people is an upper estimate based on indirect data. Realistic calculations accounting for the island's productivity and the area of cultivable land yield a figure of 3,000 to 4,000 at the peak, which fundamentally changes the picture of overpopulation. Second, the major demographic collapse occurred not before the Europeans, but after. Disease, slave trading, colonial oppression. Those are what reduced the population from several thousand to several hundred, not deforestation by itself. Third, and this is perhaps the most inconvenient argument for the narrative of self-inflicted collapse, the Rapa Nui showed signs of adaptation to changed conditions. They were not simply exhausting resources and waiting for the end. They were trying to find a way out. This refers to a discovery that completely transforms the image of the Rapa Nui in popular consciousness, from reckless destroyers of their own world into people who confronted a crisis and searched for solutions. Several years ago, archaeologists discovered on the island an extensive system of ancient garden enclosures, known as manavai. These are plots of land surrounded by stone walls, sheltered from the constant winds and salt spray that characterize the island's climate. The walls retained moisture, created a microclimate, and protected the plants. This is not primitive trial-and-error farming. This is a carefully thought-out agronomic system developed by people who understood that the soil was depleted, the climate harsh, and that working smarter was the only alternative to working harder into nothing. The extent of these garden systems proved substantial. They covered a significant portion of the island's interior. At the same time, the Rapa Nui practiced what is now called lithic mulching, the deliberate scattering of small stones across the surface of fields. This is not accidental and not decorative. Stones retain moisture, prevent erosion, and moderate soil temperature. A method that modern agronomy rediscovered and recognized as effective only in the 20th century, the Rapa Nui were applying centuries earlier, in conditions where the alternative was starvation. These findings do not absolve the Rapa Nui of responsibility for the destruction of the forests. The forests they did destroy. The paleobotanical data is unambiguous, but the findings change the interpretation. The Rapa Nui were not a civilization walking toward a cliff with their eyes closed, unaware of the fall. They saw the crisis. They responded to it. They invented solutions. The scale of the catastrophe, amplified by European intervention, simply exceeded what their solutions could absorb. Diamond built his model on the image of a people who could not stop themselves. Hunt and Lipo offer a different image, a people who struggled to survive in conditions that were becoming unbearable, not entirely through their own fault. Who is right remains an open question. Data continues to arrive, excavations continue, and every new find makes the picture more complex, more human, and less convenient for clean conclusions. Today, around 6,000 people live on Easter Island. Of those, fewer than half are indigenous Rapa Nui. Every year, around 100,000 tourists fly to the island. 100,000 people descending on an island where 6,000 live. This is not tourism, this is an invasion. Every tourist wants to photograph themselves beside a Moai, touch the stone, take home a piece of history in the form of a refrigerator magnet. The island's infrastructure is straining at every seam. The single runway operates at its limit. Fresh water is catastrophically scarce. There is nowhere to put the waste. The fragile ecosystem that barely recovered from centuries of collapse is under pressure again, this time from people with cameras and backpacks. There is something deeply ironic about the fact that the island that became the global symbol of ecological catastrophe is itself once again under threat of ecological catastrophe. Only now the threat is not called an arms race between clans, but uncontrolled tourist flow. The mechanism is identical: too many people consuming too many resources in too small a space. History, it seems, never tires of repeating itself on the same island. This refers to a paradox that no one has solved. The more the world learns about Easter Island, the more people want to see it, and the more that interest destroys the very thing they are coming to witness. The Chilean government and UNESCO are attempting to find a balance. Restrictions on tourist stays have been introduced, no more than 30 days. The Rapa Nui National Park covering most of the island, operates under strict rules. The statues may not be touched, certain areas may not be entered. Photography is permitted only from designated points. Fines for violations are real, not symbolic. In 2018, the island's authorities demanded from Chile's central government the right to independently restrict entry, and partially obtained it. The local council can now regulate tourist numbers based on the state of the ecosystem. It is a small but principled step. For the first time in a century and a half, the Rapa Nui gained actual control over at least something on their own island. The descendants of the Moai builders are fighting not only tourists, they are fighting the disappearance of themselves. The Rapa Nui language is alive but endangered. Young people speak Spanish, listen to the same music as Santiago, watch the same series. Globalization does its work quietly and without obsidian spearheads. There is no need to topple statues. It is enough for children to stop learning the language of their ancestors. A few generations and a culture disappears just as irreversibly as the forests disappeared. This refers to a threat that has no visible aggressor and no specific moment of catastrophe, only a slow, imperceptible dissolution into global uniformity. But the Rapa Nui are not giving up. The Tapati Rapa Nui festival, held every February, brings the entire island population together. 2 weeks of competitions in traditional sports, ancient dances, weaving, stone carving, and singing in the language of the ancestors. This is not a folklore show for tourists. It is a living, genuine, emotionally charged event in which every family participates. Children learn words in Rapa Nui specifically for the festival. Elders pass on the technique of basket weaving and wooden figure carving to those willing to listen. The Rongo script is being studied by linguists around the world, and several young Rapa Nui have joined this work, attempting to decipher what their ancestors encoded on 26 surviving tablets. The statues stand, those that were re-erected through restoration projects of the 20th and 21st centuries, once again gaze into the island's interior, exactly as they did 1,000 years ago. Backs to the ocean, faces toward the people. This orientation is deliberate, and it is not accidental. The Moai never looked at the sea, they looked at the living, at those they were meant to protect, at those for whom they were built. Today they look at tourists with cameras, at national park rangers in orange vests, at children playing at the foot of the Ahu platforms who do not always know what happened here. And at the horizon, the same horizon from which their creators once arrived, having crossed several thousand kilometers of open ocean in wooden canoes, without maps and without guarantees. That horizon has not changed. The ocean surrounding the island is just as boundless, just as indifferent, and just as immense as it was 1,000 years ago. It knows nothing of collapse, or slave traders, or tourists, or climate conferences where Jared Diamond is quoted. It simply exists. As these stones existed before the people, and as they will exist after. The question is, what happens between the before and the after? That is the only question that matters, and the stone faces that have been silent for 1,000 years have no intention of answering it. They are waiting for people to figure it out themselves. If you made it to this point, you just traveled 1,000 years. From the first canoes that touched a volcanic shore, to stone faces that still look out at people, trying to understand what happened here. This is not just the story of one island. It is a story about how civilizations are built and how they fall, about how ambition and resources never grow at the same speed, and about how the right answers are sometimes preserved in traditions that nobody wants to listen to. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button. It is the only way to tell the algorithm that videos like this are worth making. Subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories ahead that do not fit into school textbooks, but are worth knowing. And hit the bell, otherwise the next episode will simply scroll past you in the feed, the way this story scrolled past most people for centuries. See you next time.